The Dance of Shadows. The Andalusian sun blazed relentlessly, its golden rays casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets of Seville. In the heart of the city, where ancient history whispered through crumbling facades, Elena Rivera stood at the edge of the Plaza de Toros. The colossal structure loomed over her, a monument to tradition, art, and violence. Her hands trembled as she clutched the worn leather strap of her camera bag. She wasn't here to capture the beauty of the matador's craft. No, she was here to uncover its truths. Elena was a journalist, a seeker of raw, unfiltered stories, and this assignment was supposed to be straightforward, a deep dive into the world of modern bullfighting. But nothing about it had been straightforward since the moment she met him. Diego Navarro. He was a name whispered with reverence in the taverns, a matador whose presence electrified the air. Diego was a man who danced with death, turning the brutal tradition into an art form. But what Elena had learned, and what the world refused to see, was that Diego wasn't just fighting bulls. He was fighting something far darker, something that clung to his soul like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Diego first caught Elena's eye during her second week in Seville. She had been sitting in the back of a dimly lit tavern, her notepad filled with observations about the culture surrounding bullfighting. She had overheard two older men argue about him, their voices rising over the clinking of glasses. "He's cursed," one had said, his voice low and rough like gravel. "Cursed," the other scoffed. "You mean gifted." Elena had leaned in closer. "Why do you say he's cursed?" she asked, her curiosity overriding any social boundaries. Both men had turned to her, startled by her presence. The first man, gray-haired and weary, lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because he doesn't fight bulls, señorita. He fights himself." Intrigued, Elena found her way to Diego's next fight. The arena was alive with anticipation, the crowd buzzing like an electric current. Elena, armed with her camera, positioned herself close enough to see the sweat on Diego's brow. When he stepped into the ring, the world seemed to hold its breath. He was beautiful, she thought, though the word felt inadequate. His movements were fluid, precise, each step a calculated part of a deadly dance. The bull charged, its raw power and unstoppable force, but Diego stood his ground, his red cape fluttering like a heartbeat. In that moment, he wasn't a man. He was an enigma, a force of nature. But behind the confidence, Elena saw something else, a flicker of pain, a weight he carried that no one else seemed to notice. Their first conversation was brief. After the fight, she found him in the stables, his hands steady as he brushed down his horse. Up close, he was even more striking, his dark eyes holding a depth that made her uneasy. "You're the journalist," he said without looking at her. His voice was low, almost a growl. "And you're the matador," she replied, trying to match his intensity. For a moment, he said nothing, his focus on the horse. Then he turned to her, his gaze piercing. "Why are you here?" "To tell the truth." Diego's lips curved into a bitter smile. "The truth," he repeated. "The truth about what? The blood, the glory, or the emptiness that comes after?" His words lingered in her mind long after he walked away. Over the weeks that followed, Elena became a fixture in Diego's world. She followed him to training sessions, interviews, even quiet moments of solitude. She learned about his childhood, his rise to fame, and the sacrifices he had made along the way. But the more she learned, the more she realized how little she truly knew. Diego was a man haunted by something he refused to name, a shadow that darkened even his brightest moments. One night, after a particularly brutal fight, Elena found him alone in the arena, staring at the blood-stained sand. She approached cautiously, her camera forgotten in her bag. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning. "And neither should you," she replied. He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "This is all I know." "That's not true," she said, stepping closer. "You're more than this." Diego finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that took her breath away. "You don't understand," he said. "Every time I step into that ring, I'm fighting for my life. Not because of the bull, but because of what's inside me. The fear, the doubt, the emptiness, it's the only way I know how to keep them at bay." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You don't have to fight alone," she said softly. Their relationship began to shift after that night. Diego opened up in ways Elena hadn't thought possible, sharing pieces of himself that he had long kept hidden. She learned about the father who had abandoned him, the mother who had died too soon, the scars, both physical and emotional, that had shaped him. And as she learned about him, she began to confront her own shadows. Her relentless pursuit of the truth, she realized, wasn't just about exposing the world's flaws. It was about avoiding her own. Together, they began to heal. But healing is never simple. Diego's final fight of the season was meant to be his last. He had promised Elena he would walk away, that they would build a life together far from the arena. But as the day approached, she saw the familiar tension return, the shadow that refused to let him go. The fight was brutal, more dangerous than any she had seen before. When Diego fell, the crowd gasped, their cheers turning to cries of horror. Elena pushed through the chaos, her heart in her throat as she reached his side. His eyes fluttered open, and he gave her a weak smile. "I told you," he whispered. The shadows never let go. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched his hand. "Then we'll fight them together," she said fiercely. And for the first time, Diego believed her. In the months that followed, they left Seville behind, trading the bull ring for a quiet life by the sea. Diego's scars remained, both visible and unseen, but with Elena by his side, he began to find peace. Together, they learned that the shadows might never disappear, but they didn't have to define them. And in the end, it wasn't the fight that saved them. It was the dance, the delicate, unending dance of love, trust, and redemption.